Okay, thank you to the Mary Robinson Centre, and also thank you to Natalia and Kenny, who provided some very, very interesting and moving experiences this morning, shared them with us. I'm going to speak about something slightly different. I'm not an expert on Ireland or direct provision, although I've been lucky enough to be here this week and to find out a lot more about it. What I want to talk about more is the ongoing, what we call refugee crisis in Europe, and to try and, because Ireland is in the European Union, and as we heard this morning, migration, although it's a local experience, is also a global experience, a global phenomenon. So I'm going to try and make the links a bit more to what's happening more generally in Europe, which has been referred to as a refugee crisis. And I know that Ireland is going to have, I think, 4,000 refugees from Syria who are resettled here. So perhaps even provide a bit of context for that. So I think you probably all have seen these kind of images in the media, which have become common. Images of people fleeing conflict in Syria, Afghanistan or Iraq, or Eritrea, who are trying to reach Europe and taking these boats, taking increasingly insecure and dangerous routes to try and reach Europe. And I'm going to talk a bit about my research. This is, I don't know if you can see the figures there. It's just the latest figures from the UNHCR, which show a map of arrivals in the European Union. So we can see, this is just for the year 2016, so just so far this year, there have been already 200,000, more than 200,000 people who have arrived, mainly in Greece, also in Italy. Although it's becoming more and more complicated now because of the EU deal with Turkey, because of various different political things. So, but we can see there are about 200,000 people who have arrived so far this year, and last year over 1 million. And also you can see there the figures this year, so far this year, at least 2,500 people who have died. The figure is more than that. And those are the known deaths. There are many more people who have died en route and who we don't know about. So you can also see the top nationalities of the arrivals, and it's mainly people from Syria, from Afghanistan and Iraq, but also from other countries where there is armed conflict and where their lives are in danger through persecution. So I did research, I've been doing research trying to explore the experiences of these people who are trying, these refugees who are fleeing and who are trying to reach Europe. And in particular, looking at the different experiences of men and women and how women may face different particular insecurities and obstacles in their journeys to try and reach Europe. And women also may have different strategies of migration and different ways of experiencing migration. So I carried out research, just to give some background about where I was researching. I carried out research last year in Greece, on the Greek islands, Kos and Lesbos, where people were arriving directly from Turkey. And last year, during the summer, there were thousands of people arriving every day. And also on the refugee route, which at the time was up through the Balkans, through Macedonia and Serbia, people mainly trying to reach Germany, although now with the closure of borders, that route has been cut off and many people are trapped in Greece. And I've also been doing research in France, where I work, around Paris, where there are many refugees, and in the refugee camps around Calais. So in all of these places, I've been speaking to refugees, trying to understand their experiences, why they're coming, what they've experienced, and also speaking to the NGOs and to the political leaders who are actually not doing very much about the crisis, we have to say. So I'm going to give a few reflections starting from what I found out and talking about these people's experiences. So, but before I speak specifically about the experiences of migrants, I just wanted to make a few remarks about this notion of security and of the European Union borders. And I think this current crisis, I put crisis in inverted commas, and I'll explain why in a minute, but it highlights, I think, the way these discourses we have of European security, of wanting to secure European borders, these discourses bring out very gendered and racialized discourses and securitization of the EU borders. And we've seen an ongoing, it's not something new, an ongoing process of securing borders as Europe was meant to be about the free movement of people, but the free movement of a certain type of people. So as internal borders have supposedly been opened up, external borders have been closed, and there's been this rhetoric of security, of protecting Europe from all those other people outside who the Europeans supposedly don't want to come. And I think we've seen where, especially in the UK recently, this security rhetoric has actually led to insecurity for many people and deep divisions. And I think, so one of the things I've noticed is really the insecurity of refugees, which is produced by the way that Europe has tried to protect its borders through the Frontex organisation of border guards, through increasing border guards and border security, which has made it harder and harder to arrive in Europe legally, regularly. So these people who I met, it was impossible for them to find any other route to Europe because the routes have all been closed through border guards, through increased security, through this Eurodac system. They have very, very sophisticated data systems of collection of data to try and prevent people from coming, and which Europe, I have to say, is spending billions of euros on these systems. So when people say that they're short of money for helping refugees, for welcoming refugees, we have to think also about the budget that's gone on the security of Europe's borders. And these borders aren't just external now, we're also producing borders which are mobile and which are internal. Internal borders, as we've heard, these borders which come from discrimination between different categories of human beings who are living in Europe. So when we categorize someone as a refugee, as an asylum seeker, as an illegal migrant, we're erecting borders which prevent people from exercising their rights. And I think it's really important to recall this. And here I just wanted to illustrate on security. This is, I don't know if you, it's a complicated map, but it shows all the security apparatus that Europe has put in place to try and protect the borders. So you can see all the sea operations, the naval operations, and the border operations and the operations with neighbouring countries. They have the neighbourhood programme, which they use also to try and reinforce, to try and help you. They've given lots of money to neighbouring countries. Morocco, for example, has received billions to try and to ask them to stop migrants, because that used to be a major migrant route, that people came through Morocco. And Europe has trained border guards and given billions of euros to stop people coming that way. So this is the context within which this crisis has emerged. I think also I want to say, before I talk about particular experiences, I think calling it a crisis is problematic, because European political leaders have been very quick to say, oh, this is a crisis. But in saying this is a crisis, what they've done is they've said this is something exceptional. This is something which we didn't create. It's not our problem. It's a problem that's coming from outside of Europe. So although, as I've said, they've been building up borders for years and years and making it harder and harder for people to come, when this crisis happened, they want to see it as something external. Europe's not responsible for any of the conflicts going on in the world. Europe's not responsible for these insecure journeys. So I think this labelling as crisis it's been used to justify exceptional measures, and it's been used to justify the fact that they've turned to a humanitarian rather than a political solution. And I think we should all be taking our political representatives, both national and European, to task for the abject failure to find any kind of political answers, and to turn this more and more into a humanitarian problem. So then they can say, okay, we're going to send, humanitarian ships to rescue people. But it's not enough. We really need a political solution. And this idea of crisis also means we talk about these, we have images of masses of people, and we really overlook the individual experiences of refugees who are coming, and individual experiences which will depend on their situation, including whether they're a man or a woman. So there's a real reinforcement of dichotomies between men and women. Okay. So as I've said, all these regimes of migration control interact with the social, economic and political conditions in the countries of origin and in the countries of transit to create gendered forms of insecurity. So women may have been experiencing insecurities, inequalities in their country of origin. It may be a reason that they decide to migrate. And all of that is reinforced through the systems of migration control which have been put in place. And these insecurities are produced at the physical borders. So there's research which shows that women have a much higher mortality rate of dying at sea than men. We're not really sure exactly why. It may be because they can't swim so well. It may be because they have children that they're trying to protect. And those types of inequalities and violence have been exacerbated by the conditions, by migration control, and by the conditions which these people are forced to experience when they try to come to Europe. People come because they speak a language. So some people want to go to England because they speak English. People want to go to find somebody they know where they think they might have a chance of having a job. There were people I met, refugees who are very highly qualified and thought that in Germany they might have more chance because their employment opportunities are better of finding work. So these are the experiences. And these people have been the women had been victims of various forms of violence and insecurity along their journey. First of all, from the political authorities and the police. So there were, in all countries, and we have to say that this happens not just outside Europe. There were several women who had been victims of sexual violence, for example, in Turkey. The Turkish police, they said people had been imprisoned, they'd been victims of sexual harassment, sexual violence in Turkey. The Turkish border guards are really trying to stop anyone from coming now, so it's very dangerous, and the Turkish police have a lot of power, which makes the fact that Europe has done a deal with Turkey and said that Turkey is a safe third country very, very problematic when you hear about the stories of the abuses that are going on there. But it's not just in Turkey. There are also reports in Serbia, in Macedonia, and Bulgaria of police violence. And that violence takes a specific form against women who often have been victims of sexual abuse and sexual violence. And we know it also happens in destination countries, in retention centres, in accommodation centres. So the police and who should, in theory, be a source of security are, in fact, a source of insecurity. There's also a big problem with smugglers. And again, European political leaders have tried to say that smugglers are the cause of the problem. And, some people have called for bombing smugglers' boats. They have all these policies against smugglers, but the reason that smugglers are there and that they do business is because there's no other way to get there. So if you create a market, then it's free market, it's market economics really. The smugglers there because there's a demand, because that's the only way to come. So they can charge a lot of money. Often people talk about, really organised smuggling networks. A lot of the time it's very just local, small organisations. It could just be one person who has a fishing boat and needs money and wants to get money. In Calais, with the refugees, different refugee camps, it's organised. There are local people who have offered to smuggle people in their cars for money. So it can be an organised network. It also can just be a local person who's taking people. And the smugglers, as I've said, the price now is very, very expensive to come. So women who don't have resources often are asked for, to have sex in return for having their passage. So we have these networks of prostitution which have developed around the refugee camps in Turkey, in Greece, all along the route. In Calais, it's very well, it's not really documented because people don't want to talk about it, but everyone knows that it's going on. So it's another form of violence, having to engage in prostitution to be able to pay for your journey, to be able to pay for food for your children. So the smugglers, and then the smugglers also, there have been stories of extreme violence by the smugglers. So that's another source of difficulty. Also the living conditions, which I'm just going to try and show some pictures I took. This was on the island of Kos. So living conditions are extremely difficult and extremely precarious and insecure. This was just to illustrate, this is on the island of Kos, where, as I said, there were about 1,000 people arriving every day in the summer. And the local authorities didn't want to provide any accommodation or anything. They said, they didn't want them to be there. So basically, so lots of people were just sleeping outside in parks or in fields. There were people in the parks who were drinking out of the irrigation systems for the plants. And then the local authorities found this old abandoned hotel, which was really a very abandoned hotel with no running water, no electricity. It was designed originally for about 100 people, and there were thousands of people who were living there in very, very unhygienic and dirty conditions. That's the outside. Here you can see the inside. This was downstairs where people just had put mattresses all over the floor. The women who I met there, it's very, I don't know if you can see in the photo, but those were all men who were sleeping downstairs. So all the ground floor and all the outside space was occupied by men. The women felt very, very scared because they're still a minority. Although there are more and more women who are coming, women are still only about 20% of all the refugees who are arriving. So they were in a minority and they felt scared because they said they didn't like to be, sharing the space so intimately with all these men who they didn't know. So the women you had to go upstairs, and they barricaded themselves in the bedrooms upstairs with their children, and they were hiding. There were 2 toilets for all these people, but the women were also worried and scared about coming down to use the toilets, especially at night where there was no light because there was no electricity. So they said they wouldn't, at night, they wouldn't go out of their rooms. They were locked in, and they wouldn't even go down to go to the toilets. There were no showers or washing facilities, although when I was there, Médecins Sans Frontières was actually coming, and they installed some showers and some water pipes outside. But for women, you can imagine all the conditions with women who had small children who couldn't wash them, they couldn't wash themselves, women who had their periods and who had MSF was saying there were lots of problems with urinary infections and women just being ill because of these terrible conditions. And obviously they couldn't cook, so they were relying on local people. There was a local solidarity group who came and brought food every day to distribute to them. So these kind of insecure conditions, which are replicated, and you've probably seen photos of the camps in Idomeni in Greece and in other places, which really add to the insecurities of these women, and for women especially, the lack of access to private washing spaces or cooking spaces, the fear of living, all together in groups like this was very, very important. And something which, although it's been recognised, I talked to the UNHCR and they said, yes, of course, there should be separate safe spaces for women. Women should have their own private bathroom spaces. But it's not happening. And even in, where Europe has established these hotspots, reception centres, there are no separate spaces for women that are established. This is just another photo. This is a camp near Calais, a place called Grande Sainte. Again, you can't see anyone there. That was early in the morning because people go out at night to try and come to England. So if you go in the morning, there's no one there at all. But it was just a field of mud, really, with nothing. No showers, no water, no cooking facilities. People just camping in the mud. In Ireland, you can probably appreciate what it's like camping in the mud. As a British person, I can appreciate the horrors of camping in the mud, but then you can go home and have a shower afterwards. But these people were living there with, I met, in this camp in Grande Sainte, there were a lot of Iraqi Kurdish women who were there with their children, often travelling alone with children. And they were just, stuck in their tents and they were too scared to come out. And they were really, in very, very harsh and difficult living conditions. So we can see that, the European response has been, even in terms of providing decent accommodation for these refugees who are coming, is very, very lacking. And for women, it was providing very specific obstacles and specific difficulties. So this was just one family who were, you can see they have a little fire that they were trying to cook on, and there was rubbish everywhere, and it was really not a place that you'd want to live. And people now who are spending, living in this limbo where they are spending, months and months, and some people had been on the road for years. It's not a short journey, Some of the migrants I met, some of them had spent several years in Turkey, living around Ankara or Istanbul, living rough, trying to find work there. Then they find it's too hard, then they come to Europe. And, they're on the move, but then they're just stuck in these places and living in this limbo with very, very, very difficult living circumstances. And then it happens in European cities too. This picture was taken in Paris, where Syrians are just camping by the side of I don't know if you know Paris, but the Périphérique, the big motorway that goes around the outside, just under the Périphérique there was a big migrant camp of Syrians. And this woman who'd come from Homs, whose husband had been killed, and she was there with her children. And, really, she just expressed the horror of having to live in this way. There were many families living like this. This woman also, I think, illustrates another point which I wanted to make, the insecurity which comes from the attitudes of your, not just political authorities and the lack of the access to facilities and the violence. There's physical violence and there's, insecurity from these terrible accommodation conditions, but also from the stereotypes and from the attitudes of and the discourses that there have been around refugees. And I think it's very, we're talking about women, but they've been very gendered representations. So more and more we've seen all these discourses about, okay, I'm finishing, about how migrant men are perceived as a threat often. So the young men are seen as a threat. They're seen as a threat because now they've been associated with terrorism. Also, migrant men who are associated with the threat of sexual violence. So we saw, there was a big debate about what happened in Cologne on New Year's Eve, and amongst the terrible things that have been said in the UK debate, Nigel Farage did say that migrant men were a sexual threat to British women. So we have all these terrible stereotypes, racist and gendered stereotypes of migrant men being a terrorist threat, being a sexual threat. And women, on the other hand, women are often portrayed as more vulnerable as victims. So in all the official policies from UNHCR, from the humanitarian organisations, they have a list of, vulnerable migrants, and the most, one of the most vulnerable categories are women who are on their own, women with children. So vulnerability, in a way, perhaps women can use this as a strategy. Some of the women, women are not stupid, and they're not just vulnerable victims. They have agency and they have knowledge. So some of the women had actually subverted this label of vulnerability and were trying to use it for their own means. So some women now have strategies where they deliberately come on their own because they know that if they come as a single woman, they'll be treated as vulnerable, so they might have more access to protection. It might be easier for them to access protection. And then the hope is that they can bring their families to join them afterwards. We shouldn't be pushing people into these categories of vulnerability, but just to say that women aren't just victims. They have strategies, and they, often very intelligent, and they know what they're doing, and they fight, and they have enormous strength and courage. The media, the politicians are finding it very easy to fall into these stereotypical representations of threat or of vulnerability, and not really experiencing the individual, not really listening to the individual experiences of migrants. And a woman like that, who was very highly qualified, would have very little chance of accessing the labour market, of finding a job. And I'm going to conclude. I have lots more to say, but I'm going to go on to my conclusions. You can ask me lots of questions, and I'll... So to conclude, I just wanted to say, really, this research has been very difficult. I think, personally, to hear the stories of refugees, to hear the stories of these women, you understand, for men and women, the difficulties of the journey, the violence of the journey. And I think we all have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to hold our politicians, our political leaders to account for their abject failure to deal with this issue. Europe has welcomed, in the exhibition, we see Irish men and women were migrants, and now Ireland has immigrants. But all of Europe, Europeans have migrated. Europe has had many, many waves of migration and people who've come. And if we really want to build a truly secure Europe, a true security is about ensuring security for individuals by listening to their experiences, by recognising their needs for protection, and by really opening our borders. And as citizens, as European citizens, I think it is our duty to push for this and to hold our politicians to account and say, we don't want a security that passes through more Frontex and more border guards. We want a security that passes through the recognition that all of these people have human rights, and we need to do everything we can to establish these rights and to break down both the external and the internal borders. So I'm going to conclude there.